marine acoustics, which, by the way, addresses our youngest performance element 4.3.8. This performance element was added last year with approval from the IARPIC principals, and we have been tracking these kind of research activities since then. So without further ado, I guess, unless there are any questions regarding this, we will move to the IARPIC collaboration member updates, which is the next agenda item. So in this section of the call, we invite all of you to provide information or updates, announcements, or findings, paper, cruises, research activities that you are starting, or actually if you are looking for collaborations to get some new ideas moving forward, this is your chance. So I open up the floor for all of any one of you to provide any updates. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, this is Jackie Grabmeyer. I would just say I was at Ocean Obs 19 in Honolulu last week, and although it was a large international meeting talking about observation, there was a breakout session on the Arctic that Molly McCammon and Sandy Starkweather led, and there's a white paper if you go to the Arctic Obs 19 that is recommendations for coordinated observing under the Sustaining Arctic Observing Network. And there is also a recommendation that'll come out with the other large world ones specifically related to the needs of studying the Arctic. So I would just point people to the Ocean Obs 19 site.
Guillermo, you're on mute.
Any other, thank you, any other updates?
So this is Danielle Dixon. I just want to remind people that abstract submission is open for the Alaska Marine Science Symposium. The symposium will occur the last week of January here in Anchorage, Alaska. I believe abstract submission is open until the 7th of October. So please think about joining us and submit your abstracts.
Yep. Any other updates or questions regarding what I mentioned about IARPIC, this collaboration team, and or this particular meeting, especially for our new members?
No, the only other thing I would add is there is an abstract deadline in October 2 for the meeting in Japan, International Symposium Arctic Research 6. So if you just put ESAR 6 in the web search, you'll find that too. Just a deadline on that. And I would mention that on our webpage, if people are interested under the different performance elements, you can find out what we did in past years and this year and plans to do for the next year, right? That people could look at as attachments.
Okay. Now that I remember, BOM is going to be co-chairing a session at Ocean Sciences 2010 in February in San Diego, California. And the broad topic of this session and others in that group is social interactions and ocean science. And our particular session is going to address resilience science and natural resource management. And we are going to have at least, if I remember right, at least 3 presentations Arctic related. So I will send more information on that, and I will put the times and dates on the IARPIC website.
And I would just say the same thing. We have a session I'm co-chairing on the marine ecosystems specifically for the Arctic with Seth Danielson and Catherine Eichen and Lee Cooper. That session is a go. It has about 45, 50 abstracts were submitted. So, and there's going to be a session that Molly McCammon is leading on a town hall to talk about Arctic issues, particularly the rapid changes being seen in the northern Bering Sea. So stay tuned.
They received, Ocean Sciences received an all-time record of abstracts. It was 5,700 and something.
Wow.
So they are expecting a record attendance in February. Any other announcements or updates? One more quick update is that the IARPIC principals met last week at the White House EOB building. And there were a number of topics in the agenda. There was a presentation from Tom Newman on the ICESat mission from NASA, in very impressive capabilities of ICESat-2, not only for producing information over the polar areas, but also in tropical areas. They can produce amazing information with super high resolution. Then there was a presentation from Sandy Starkweather on the observational needs of the US and the relationship to national security and economic development issues. There will be I hope there is a report that Sarah Bowden will present at the next call. There was also a discussion on STEM education that the National Science Foundation is leading. They are very active on this topic, and they are giving it a really high priority, as it should. And then there was a very interactive presentation from Jackie Richter-Mengi on the usefulness of IARPIC to different federal agencies and how that is serving the community and what agencies want for the next cycle, for the next 5-year cycle. So there was a very practical interaction between Jackie, the chair of the principals, Dr. Franz Cordova, who is the director of the National Science Foundation, and the agency representatives. And then finally, there was a presentation of the expected timeline for the new Arctic Research Plan, the 2022-2027 plan that we will start drafting towards the end of this calendar year. So there will be more on that as we move forward.
Thanks.
Anything else from anyone before we start with the presentation from Catherine and Manuel? If not, let's go ahead and get Catherine and Manolo presenting.
Oh, I need to unmute. Okay, I will share my screen now. Okay, y'all see it? Okay, good.
Yes.
Got that from Daniel. All right, so this is a project that we are still working on. These are just preliminary results today, and it is something that Manolo and I are collaborating with a bunch of different scientists, particularly Dimitri from the Cornell Bioacoustics Research Program, who's basically been instrumental in their acoustic ecology toolbox that we've been using for the noise metrics here. So, of course, my arrow key doesn't work. A second here. There we go. So some of you have seen this before. Basically, we've had an array of long-term acoustic recorders in the Beaufort, Chukchi, and Bering Sea since about 2007. Here is a map of those locations. The blue indicates that the recorder is either on an oceanographic mooring itself or in a cluster with other oceanographic instrumentation. The greens are just recorders. And so the name of this array is, we call it the Ultima Array for Arctic Long-Term Integrated Mooring Array, just to give it a name because these recorders have been going out under many different projects over the years, and it just got a little confusing. So we're just accumulating them under one umbrella called Ultima. Most of these moorings have been funded by BOEM over the years. There's been, recently, the Navy has been funding some of our work from the Bering Strait north, and NOAA Fisheries has been funding some of the work from the Bering Strait south. Today we're going to be talking about one particular project that was funded by NOAA, Ocean Acoustics S&T, to characterize marine mammal acoustic spaces in 3 locations. And our research, our research objectives for this are to maintain the long-term time series that are over a decade now at these 3 sites in Unimak Pass, south of the Bering Strait in the Chirikov Basin, and then up in the Chukchi Plateau. And we've also basically been describing the seasonal occurrence of sound sources in these locations, both over time and over space. And then we're using these to characterize the noise metrics that Manuel will be talking about. And then as our final step, we're going to take our vessel noise information and combine that with the vessel traffic maps that Alaska Audubon has been generating. We're not to that step yet. Today we're going to be mostly talking about the 3rd step here, the noise. And we picked these 3 sites because of the differences in vessel traffic. So high would be Unimak Pass, which is sort of the bottleneck of everything coming and going from the Bering Sea, near the Bering Strait in the Chirikov Basin, and then up in the Chukchi Plateau, like I said. And this is just a map from 2016, the year we're presenting these data, of just the vessel traffic in and out of these areas. And you can see Unimak Pass is sort of the reddest, biggest bottleneck there. Just to give you a reference, so here's the near Bering Strait site, and then the Chukchi Plateau is up here. So what we usually do with our analysis is we go through it. There's manual analysts that go through all the data for 11 different species of marine mammals, 2 anthropogenic sound sources, vessels, and air guns, and then environmental, they flag whether they hear ice or not. And we do this in a binned way, so it's sort of the equivalent of reading a book, seeing the whole book at once, as opposed to listening to like an audio book where you're having to listen to the whole thing. We can have the analyst look at chunks, usually about 3 minutes worth like this, and they can say yes, no to the presence of sound sources in there and move right along. And then after all the results are in, we use this for the seasonal distribution and spatial distribution, and then we can combine it into subsets. So say we just want those wave files that have bowhead whales and no other species in it, no other vessel noise or anything like that. We can pull those out. We can also look for something like the baseline ambient noise, which would be the equivalent to a distant highway you're listening to where you can't distinguish the sounds of individual vehicles going by. It's just that low hum. That's the baseline ambient in any kind of area. And then we feed these subsets to the Acoustic Ecology Toolbox, and this is where Manolo is going to take over. So I need to stop my share, and you need to start yours.
Okay, so I'm sharing now the screen, see if you guys see it. Can you see it? Do you see the slide or?
Yes, we do.
Yes.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yes, yes.
And yeah. Do you see my cursor moving around? No.
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
you see it? Oh, okay, okay, perfect. Good. Well, so The upper panel, the one we have my cursor, this is just an example to explain to you how do we basically extract the acoustic energy contribution of each of different species or air guns or ships, all different sound sources that we can hear, as Catherine was mentioning. So the upper panel is a spectrogram of 11 months from October to August of 16 to 17. And so,
Hi, Manuel.
yeah.
That we're having a little bit of trouble hearing you. You might have to speak closer to the microphone.
Oh, okay. Let's see, because yeah, this is a laptop where I'm not sure where the microphone is.
That sounds
Do you
better.
hear better now? Okay, so I'll talk like this on the side. Okay, so the spectrum you see, the upper panel has vertical bands. Those vertical bands, the lighter blue bands, are the files or the chunk of recording that has nothing else than ambient noise. So this is an example of how do we create a spectrum curve for the ambient noise levels in that particular location. So all those bands are the recordings that the analysts went through and basically qualify them as recording time without any type of source other than the ambient noise. So all these bands then are processed in 1 hour bins. So these 11 months, for example, in this plot, are cut in 1 hour bins. And so all these thousands of 1 hour bins are processed with the Acoustic Ecology Toolbox, which is developed by Cornell, the Acoustic Research Program. And so it's creating a single spectrum, which is the dB level for each frequency. So you end up with a figure that shows you how much acoustic energy you have in dBs for each of the frequencies that you are covering your recording. And so this middle panel, the panel down here, what it's showing you is a cloud of little dots. All these blue dots are presenting one measurement of one frequency for 1 hour of that whole time period. So when we just gather them together, you see this cloud of dots is showing you all the distribution of the dB values for each frequency across the whole time period when there was nothing else than ambient noise. And so using that cumulative or density plot, then we calculate the 50th percentile, 25th percentile, 75th percentile, which is basically the green, red, and the dark blue lines, these three lines here. The red line is the 75th percentile, which means that 25% of the time, the noise level was at that value, at this curve here, which is, for example, here in 1,000 hertz, we were down to 64 dBs or something like that. So 25% of the time. If you go down to the 50th percentile, which is the green line, it means that, let's say here to 100 hertz, it's a better example. The 100 hertz, the levels were at somewhere 65 dBs, 50% of the time, but 25% of the time they were closer to 70 dBs. So that's how you interpret the percentiles for this spectrum. So what we do is from the raw data where we know there is nothing, we just calculate the density of the spectrum, and then from that density distribution, we get the 50th percentile, which are these curves down here, 50th, 75th, and 25th percentiles. So these three curves in these plots down here, the left plot, for example, is telling you what is the ambient noise level in that particular location when nobody is doing any sound, when there is no animals, when there is no ships, or at least ships that we don't recognize in a spectrogram. It might be some distant ships, and there is no ice noise. We divide it into seasons. In this particular case, we have the ice season on the left and the open water season, and that's because the ice is creating a very strong effect in the sound. So you can see here, by ice we mean anytime we have more than 15% coverage within 15 miles away from the mooring site. So we use satellite imagery to get to these dates, and so once we know the start and end date for what we call the ice season, then we group those data sets and create those percentiles in this plot. So what you can see between the two plots, the left and right plot in the lower end of the slide, is the percentiles for the ice season are much lower than the percentiles for the open water season, meaning that in winter, the ambient noise is much quieter than in summer. And that's mainly because the ice is coupling the atmosphere from the water, so we don't have the wind effect of the rain and all the different influences in the surface of the water that generate sound. And also the scattering of sound, so the layer of ice is absorbing noise, and therefore your noise level is quieter than in summer. So it's a good example to see, the two differences between the two time periods. And you see the distribution of these three curves also give us some information. Like, for example, in the ice season, you see that by 900 hertz or so, they're very close to each other, meaning there is very little variability. Like the ambient noise variation through these many thousands of hours of data are very similar. There's very little variation. But in the lower frequencies, because they are more apart between the 25th and the 75th percentile, there is more degrees in between. It means there is more variability. So some days it's louder, some other days it's quieter. And that's why you can see that basically natural variation in noise by just looking at these three curves. And so we use these three curves as our reference to explain what is the natural ambient noise level in each of the locations by the ice season or the automatic season. And then on top of those curves, we plot the different contributors. So the next slide shows you the ambient noise in the three locations that Catherine mentioned. The upper one is the Chukchi Plateau in winter and summer. The middle one is the Bering Strait in winter and summer. And the Untitled Pass, the lower two panels, basically there is no ice in that region. So we only have one plot that corresponds to the whole year between 2016 and 2017. So just quickly going through these curves, you can see again both the Chukchi Plateau and Bering Strait ambient noise levels are lower in winter than in summer. So if you compare left to right, the left plots are always lower in dB values than the upper plots. Chukchi Plateau, it's interesting to see that there is very little variability. You see the three spectra, the 25th, 50th, and 75th spectra, they are very close to each other. There is very little difference in dB values between the three curves, both in winter and summer, compared to Bering Strait, which means that is a very homogeneous, very constant ambient noise level in that region. The Bering Strait, on the other hand, you see there is much more variability between 25th and 75th percentile in the lower frequencies, mainly, meaning that it's a much more variable ambient noise condition in that area, more in the ice in winter than in summer. So that's something we don't have a clear explanation of why we have so much variability in this curve. You see they're not so clean and linear like in summer. They're much more wiggly. That could be because of propagation conditions and the natural characteristics of that location. So Bering Strait is a funneling area. We might have more dynamic, more water movement and currents, and might be creating some more natural ambient noise. And then lower panel, the lower two panels in the slide. As I mentioned, this is the whole year, and you can see we have a spike in these lower frequencies in the 25th percentile. That's most likely related to flow noise. So Inumiak is a very narrow passage, and the amount of current there is higher than the other places. So the flow going around the microphone or the hydrophone is creating noise, like if I'm blowing in a microphone, it would be similar. So it's an artificial noise that we cannot avoid. It's not a natural contributor of noise. It's just like the flow, the water flowing through the capsule of the hydrophone, and it's just elevating the low levels of the lower frequencies only 25% of the time. You see the 50th percentile and 75th percentile, they don't have any influence flow noise. So again, not much variation in that area, they're all very close to each other. And the dB values, you see these three curves start between 85 and 95 dBs, which is a bit higher than what we see in Bering Strait, and also the same thing with the Chukchi Plateau. So the ambient noise in Inumiak is a bit higher than in the other locations, even if there's not much variability. I'm not sure if there's anything else to mention here. I think that's kind of the idea, to show you the ambient noise curves. Remember, those are data without any other contributors, so it's just natural noise. So this example here is showing you the contribution of bowhead whales, and so the orange line is the 50th percentile, meaning 50% of the time bowhead contribution is values for this. So you see that the orange curve is higher than the three curves for ambient noise, all the way to somewhere, I would say, here by 7,000, 8,000 hertz, which means that the contribution of bowhead signals is covering the whole frequency range that we are recording, and it's higher than the 20th percentile. So most of the time, bowhead signals are higher than ambient noise level, which makes sense. So it's why our bowhead contribution is important. And so the way we're presenting this data is not just the values that we collected by files where there's only bowhead, which would be the orange line, but what are those levels in reference to the natural ambient noise, including the variability of the ambient noise, and that's why we have three curves. So if you consider the 50th percentile of the noise, which would be the middle line, we would say that bowhead whales are above, the contribution is above all the frequencies that we are measuring. But if you consider the 75th percentile, which is 25% of the time in a location, you see there's overlap down at 3 kilohertz. So the contribution of bowheads would be important only up to 3 kilohertz. That's why we think it's really important to present the different contributors always in reference to the ambient noise in the area. Because if we delete the three blue curves and we only present the orange curve, we have no reference to say, well, you know, how much this species is contributing to the area, how many dBs, let's say at 100 hertz, is this really 70 dBs of contribution, or is this like the 10, 15 dBs that we have between the orange and the blue line? So it's important to make sure that when we talk about contributors, we are presenting information in the background. And I don't know if we can play just to give a sense of how it sounds. You might not hear it. Do you hear that? Too faint. Anyway, just giving a sense of how the Bowhead signals look like. You have a spectrum here. You can see that a lot of energy is in low frequencies, but there is also important energy in higher frequencies when they're singing. So the next slide. Oops, sorry. Good. So this is Bowhead whale contribution in the Chukchi Plateau and Bering Strait, both in summer and winter periods. So you see that. Very interestingly, for the Chukchi Plateau, the 50th percentile for Bowhead whale signals is below the ambient noise. It's even below the 25th percentile, which means there's two ways to interpret this. It means that the whales are vocalizing with a very, very low source level, so they're very, very quiet when they call, which is likely not the case, or that they are picking time windows where the ambient noise is very, very low in the environment, which is, you know, less than 25% of the time, ambient noise is below these levels, the light blue. But you see the curve is even lower, which means that most likely these whales are using the ambient noise, and they're calling or singing only when the ambient noise is very low to maximize detection range, to maximize the, you know, how far they can reach. So that's something we want to look into more detail because it's an interesting result that we found in Bowheads, but also on bearded seals. So you see that during the ice season, their calling contribution is matching the 25th percentiles, which means that 75% of the time, the ambient noise is just at the same level of this Bowhead calling. So it's, again, a very small contribution to the environment. On the other hand, in Bering Strait, you see that the orange curve is higher than the three blue lines, meaning that the contribution is very strong compared to the ambient noise in the winter. In summer, that curve is a bit more in between the three, the 25th and 50th percentile, which means that their contribution is above ambient noise only on, you know, let's say 50% or 25% of the time. So it's really important to see how the change in natural ambient noise, but also the change in intensity of the signals varies with season. So we need to characterize soundscapes considering differences to the season. It can be average over a whole year because you are losing a lot of information there. So if you only focus on the orange line for Bering Strait, you see here the curve goes all the way up to 900 hertz or 700, and then it starts dropping down. On the other hand, in the summer, the curve is always a more continuous gradient, you know, going down in intensity. We think that's because during winter, that's when I'm singing, there is more energy in higher frequency compared to summer. In summer, they only do shorter sequence of calls. They're not singing, and those calls tend to be lower in frequency. So the contribution seems to be more important in the lower end of the spectrum compared to winter, where you have a much wider frequency range. So these type of curves are not only telling us how much that contribution is compared to ambient noise, but also what is the frequency range of the if I move to, this is a good good example of their presence in the area. So here you see the three plots. You have the blue line is the ice concentration, so there's no ice and there's increasing ice, and you know, going to the winter season with 100% ice and spring. And the whales are present mainly in spring and fall. That's for Chukchi Plateau, right? The Bering Strait, you see that they come in a bit later, so they show up by later spring during the winter, and then they're gone by spring when they go up to the sea. So if we look at the time domain, trying to understand when these animals are present, you see that it's very different to consider what happens in spring. Let's say, let's focus on the middle panel here. Spring, they're not there quite often, maybe early or during winter. Spring is here. They're passing through in spring, then they spend little time in winter, and they're coming back by the end of winter and starting of the ice station. So basically, it's important to understand that the seasonality of the species. So we cannot just overview. We can just create an average in a whole year, because you are using time period when there's nothing there. You need to make sure that you know when these animals are there to properly characterize the contribution of acoustic energy in the environment. And this is the same story, but for bearded seals. So you see in the Chukchi Plateau, we only have bearded seals in winter. We don't have them in summer. So the winter curve, again, is between the 25th and 50th percentile, showing that the amount of acoustic energy for these animals is not very strong compared to other sources. So they might be farther away from the hydrophone, or they might be calling lower surf level, which we should figure out which of the two ones is the explanation. You don't know, but it seems that to me, when they are near near the ice in winter, we have a more obvious contribution of these species than when the ice is gone in that area. And also, same for Bering Strait, you see that the contribution is more important in the summer than winter, so it's kind of different than the Plateau. And the contribution of these species, again, is between the 25th and 50th percentile in the winter, but then it really exceeds the 75th percentile in summer. So it's much more important contribution in summer than in winter in this region. And again, if you look at the frequency distribution, so we can see that the overlap for the 75th percentile of ambient noise is from somewhere 100 Hz all the way up to almost 8 kilohertz. So they are covering a wide range of frequencies compared to the winter, where you can see they're just crossing the 75th percentile is barely touched at this frequency, and then it stays underneath. So not just the amount of energy, but also the frequencies that these animals are using or are contributing to are different in winter and summer. And then the last, again, the seasonality. Sorry, I always forget about this plot. The seasonality of these animals is very different than Bowhead. You see that in Chukchi Plateau, they're barely there only at the end of winter. In the Bering Strait, they are there as soon as the ice shows up. Very seals are there, and they are very intense by the end of the season. By the time the ice is melting, they're still at 100%. So all the hours analyzed for that particular time period were, we could see very seals, and then they very quickly just disappear by the end of the fall period. There is that fall. That's it's the spring. Sorry. And then obviously in Umiak Pass we didn't have any very seals there, so we have no data on that region. And the last slide is just showing you the vessel contributions. So those plots are created with has only vessel noise. There is nothing else than vessel. There is not bird seals or bowheads. It's only vessel. And so you can see is the 50th percentile. So this is the vessel contribution. This kind of matching is very close to the 25th percentile for ambient noise. So the amount of noise in the Bering Strait, it doesn't seem to be very high compared to the ambient noise level. Which is interesting because we were assuming that that's a funneling area for shipping, but there's not too many ships crossing, so it's not a very strong contribution compared to Umiak Pass, where it's more vessels. So you can see the orange curve starts about 94 dB. Up here it starts in the 76, 77, so it's way lower in dB values than the one in Umiak Pass. But again, if you consider the ambient noise, look at the blue lines in Umiak, they're also very close to shipping noise line. So it means that when you consider how high is the ambient noise in the area, shipping noise is still very close to the ambient noise levels. So a way to interpret this is that we most likely have decent shipping into our files where we consider there is nothing in them. And so we're getting some noise from decent ships. So the ambient noise curves are close to the shipping. But anyway, the shipping contribution is higher in Umiak than in Bering Strait, because you can see the values, the range here is from 55 to 75 compared to almost 95 to 55. So lower frequencies especially are much more influenced by shipping in Umiak Pass and Bering Strait. And so the amount of files we had with only shipping in the Chukchi are so few that we couldn't even create a 50 percentile curve. So it's only a few hours, but 2 hours of data shows shipping noise in that location compared to the 65 hours in Bering Strait and 1,076 hours in Umiak. So it gives you at least the amount of presence and absence gives you a very clear indication of the gradient from north to south. And yeah, so that's just for the data we wanted to show you. The next slide, well, again, here you can see the seasonality of shipping. Obviously, ships are persistent in the Umiak Pass. They're only happening when there is no ice in the Bering Strait, and very few ships went through in summer in the Plateau. So the seasonality is very obvious for shipping to industry location. So the idea of this analysis is to basically do this in the long run. This is just showing you data from 2016 and 17, but we have a decade of data. So the idea is to apply this methodology to go through the decade of recordings in the different locations and look at trends. So just to give you 3 bullets of what we are taking out of this analysis is that we obviously can see that the ambient noise levels have to be considered when you're looking at contributors. You cannot present contributors of acoustic energy to the acoustic environment without knowing what are your baseline ambient noise levels. And also the seasonality, as I showed you in this plot, is really important. We need to know when in the year we have this contributor. We cannot average over 12 months when that particular source of noise is happening only a few weeks in spring or in fall. So we need to make sure that we understand the seasonal component of the presence and absence of these different sources. And then the last bullet point is just talking about the frequency domain. Like, it's obvious that each species or each source of noise is going to be contributing to specific frequencies. And those frequencies really depend on what do you consider to be the baseline of ambient noise. If the ambient noise that you consider is the 50th percentile, the median, it might be a shorter frequency range of contribution that you're thinking of the 75th percentile of ambient noise. So the combination of ambient noise variability and the spectra for your source of noise has to be considered to be able to describe which frequencies are affected by the different sources. And then one more slide, which is, the homework that we still need to go through. So many tons of data to go through to create these curves and compare them across locations and years. But basically, the idea is to get a good understanding of the interannual variability, how this changes through the years. And an obvious one is to look at the trend in shipping, how increasing shipping is going to change the amount of noise coming out of ships and how that changes the acoustic environment. But also, things like, how can we explain a lower 50th percentile for bowheads and bird seals than the 25th, even the 25th percentile of ambient noise? How can they vocalize in super low conditions? So that's something we're very interested in looking at. See how they, purposely select very quiet days to call and or sing. And then, as Catherine mentioned, an interesting thing that we are looking forward to do is combining the acoustic contribution of shipping to the density maps that Audubon Society is working for the Arctic to get an understanding of the noise distribution across the Arctic, considering the location of these vessels. And I think that's it. I don't know, Catherine, if there is something else we wanted to mention that I missed or forgot to talk about.
No, why don't you forward on to the acknowledgement slide?
Oops.
And one thing to think about here is, so Manolo was mentioning the Bering Strait, that it didn't have as much vessel noise as we were expecting, but that is the data from 2016, and we're just going to expect that vessel noise is going to be increasing as time goes on. And the question we can all ask ourselves as part of this team is, how, with the ice diminishing and vessel traffic increasing, how can we inform future adjustments to the shipping lanes? I know they're sort of already set, but can we adjust them either spatially or set rules like there are in the Gulf of Massachusetts as far as seasonal slowdowns or other things to basically help keep the ships away from when the animals are there, and also just their noise effects on those animals.
Yeah, just to add up to that, like those 50th percentile scripts I show you for better seals and bowheads, we didn't have much time, but if we had more time, I would have shown you a figure where you have the 50th percentile of the species and the 50% of shipping to give you a sense of how much overlap and how much potential masking in communication might be happening by just looking at the 50th percentile, which is 50% of the time. And so that's part of the analysis. We'll look at the relationship between ship noise and the different biological contributors to the different locations to kind of characterize or quantify how much masking is happening for each species.
So that's all we have on that.
Well, this is Danielle. Thank you both very much for your presentation. It's really interesting. I'd like to open it up to questions. Does anyone have any questions for either of our presenters?
This is Kyle Beck from ONR. I don't have any questions, but I have a couple of comments. One, the long time series data is really, really important, and so it's really great to see that you guys have that. That's something that we lack in the Navy. And because we lack that data, what we're able to do now is make anecdotal comparisons between different places. We don't have any way to really quantify them, and having the long time series data will allow you and ultimately, eventually us to be able to do that. The other thing I want to comment on is there's an international standards organization that has terminology for underwater acoustics, and I'm in my programs, I'm trying to get my performers to look at the standards for underwater acoustics, because in that are different definitions for underwater sound, or sorry,
Thank
all.
you. That's really useful. Yeah. So we talked. So the 25th, 50th, and 35th percentiles that we present, we like to call them background noise levels, and just because what you said is that we can. So our analysis is based on the visual and oral analysis of the humans going through spectrograms. So there is definitely contributions of noise by distant shipping or distant eyes, or sources that are near through the spectrum that we are missing. So we cannot truly say those are ambient noise curves, because we don't have the capability to really say there is nothing else than the physical environment, excluding anthropogenic and biological input in there. But if we call those ambient noise curves, it would imply that there is nothing else than the water and the bottom of the seafloor and the wind moving that water, which is basically impossible to confirm. So, but yeah, you're right. The differentiated ambient noise or background noise is an important one, and at least in our literature, in our field in bioacoustics, is mixed all the time. People are using background noise or ambient noise, or it's not a clear separation of definitions.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. I think that's a good place to look at as the standard and try to see how that fits in with what we're doing and use the same terminology.
It's not easy.
So this is Danielle. I have a question for you. Catherine, at the end you talked about potentially looking at, shipping lanes and considering things like ship speed and adjusting that to avoid interactions with marine mammals. And one question I have is, can you use that AIS data to look at the speed of the ships that you're listening to and compare the speed of the ship and the frequency of the sound it produces, and then the co-occurrence of marine mammals, to look at, would you actually, in terms of noise masking, would a faster vessel speed actually produce less masking for some species that call in that low frequency range, and then, how you balance that with, potential for vessel strikes and that sort of thing? Is that something you can look at with your data?
We're hoping to. Hopefully, the problem with Alaskan waters is a lot of ships aren't going to be covered under that AIS, especially down in Unimak Pass, where there's a lot of fishing vessels that are probably too small to have to do that. So I think we're definitely going to be looking at that once we get our noise curve situated and can talk to Ben at Audubon for that. And then you have a very good point with the slowing and speeding up of vessels. There's been a lot of work done with this. And I just attended a DOCITS talk online for vessel noise, and it was two people from Canada, Transport Canada, I believe it was, and it's online and it's available for people to listen to. It was actually really well done, and they were talking about differences between slow vessels, and those ones show a potential if you reduce their machinery noise versus the fast ones where you have to worry about prop noise. But just the different things they were saying, they ran some just little test cases up in the Canadian waters of providing incentives to ships to slow down, because it costs them a lot of money when they have to slow down. In terms of things like their docking fees are reduced if they can show that they've slowed down. So there's just a lot of work that can be done with that sort of before it becomes a problem for us more than it sort of already is in Unimak.
Thanks. Does anyone else have any questions or comments? Catherine, I have one more question for you. The data that you've showed here were all collected from stationary passive acoustic recorders. I wonder what, if anything, you could say about what the addition of data collected from tags placed directly on marine mammals that record sound could offer you in terms of comparing dB levels of sound produced by marine mammals, vocalizations in relation to ambient noise. So you don't have that distance factor confounding your analyses.
I'm just going to answer that and say that this is a better question for Manolo, but as far as putting those sort of tags on in Alaskan waters, the problem is that the animals don't really stay put. So you're going to put the tag on and maybe never get it back to retrieve those data. And acoustic data are usually really big, so you can't just have it transmitting back with the satellite. But Manolo's actually done things like this, so I'm going to let him answer that question.
Yeah, it's a very good question, Daniel, because the problem with mooring data is that we have the receive levels of what the whales or the seals were projecting into the environment. So we don't know if they are modifying their surf level based on the ambient noise. And we know for some species like, beluga whales and right whales, we know that when it's noisier, they tend to increase their surf level to basically fight with the masking effect. So it could be that or they reduce or increase their surf levels, or it's just that they peak the specific days when the ambient noise is different. And that's why we see those differences in relationship between ambient noise or background noise and the curve for the different species. But having data on the animals definitely would be the best way to go. And as Catherine said, it's very difficult, very challenging, and quite often those tags are not lasting long time. And so you only have a little window where maybe the ambient noise didn't change enough. And so it's not an easy task. I think it's probably better to get a sense of how many animals we have in the area, like aerial survey, something that gives you a sense of location of animals over years, so you know how they use in the area, and then you understand if you are within their migration route or you're away from that area, or they kind of sit on top of your mooring. So give you a better understanding of where the animals are in relation to your mooring. That would give you a bit more information on how we can use the receive levels. But again, it's a very hard question to answer, and the problem is that we would need both the ambient noise at the whale and the surf level at the whale. So yeah, as you said, the only way to do that is with a tag on the whale. And there is some development. There's a new tag being developed. Actually, the Navy is funding part of it, which is it's a longer term and is archiving the data. And there's another version that is basically trying to send snippets of the data. So it's processing their sound internally and then sending just values, just dB values or spectral values. So yeah, satellites. So those might be a better way or better tools, more suited for this type of research question.
And I do want to add, as far as the future work, well, the upcoming work we have to do with this, the problem is that a lot of these plots that we showed you are just bowheads, but bowheads occur a lot of times with bearded seals, so we're not showing the data that have both bowhead and bearded seal in there. So the bearded seals are serving as noise for the bowheads and vice versa. So when we combine our different subsets, we'll be able to kind of look at that. So bowheads are exposed to noise from ships, but they're also exposed to noise from bearded seals. So that's something we're going to be looking at more this fall.
Interesting, thanks. One thing potentially to consider is, I know Craig Lee has talked about his project funded by ONR putting out an array of acoustic receivers underwater north of Alaska, and I wonder if the stars align properly to allow you to get some tags out. If the animals frequented the area of their array, I wonder if you could use that underwater array to transmit the data as opposed to relying on satellites.
I'll just pitch in. Yeah, I mean, that would be awesome. And the underwater communication is really developing. And yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not aware of any passive acoustic system that is transmitting the information. All we know is, the pingers that are used on fish, where you have an array of receivers, and then you implant those things on fish, and then you know what they're passing through. So that's kind of the only kind of close applicability I've seen so far. And I know, like, there's a lot of underwater communication, modems for industries. So there's definitely good potential, and technology is kind of there. It's just a matter of having the funding and the brains of people to put together a system that is recording sound and then transmitting the information via underwater modems. Maybe in 10, 15 years, we'll have that.
Okay, well, we'll open it up. If anyone has any more questions or comments for our presenters, please go ahead. And if not, if anyone has any last updates, programmatic or otherwise, that you'd like to share before we end the call, please share them.
So Guillermo wanted me to present on Eloise Fran's paper on ribbon sills. Is that now a good time?
Sure.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. Let me share my screen again. I just made some slides so I don't have to hand wave over the phone. Okay, so here's the paper. It's in Polar Biology. And of course there's an arrow.